Good. How are you?
Doing great.
Good.
Um, so Julie, I don't know how I first found you, but your content really brought me in. Seeing your page, and you have family yields. You want to explain a little bit about that, and like I guess who you are?
Sure. So Family Yields is actually based in permaculture, which right out of the gate, that might put people into like a spin of like, what is she talking about? Because permaculture is really the study of natural systems and then how can we apply those to human systems. So the name Family Yields is like, how do we use our family system and create the best possible yields, which is something that we look at a lot in permaculture, which started as like a garden design system, right? Like for agriculture. So the
Hmm.
words actually mean like permanent agriculture. So a lot of what I'm trying to do is actually bring those two worlds together between like the world of permaculture into more of like a social permaculture. So how do we use natural systems to influence the ways in which we're operating in within our family systems? So that's why that name exists. And so kind of all I do is trying to pull these different threads together. On my page, I talk a lot about parenting, gentle
Hmm.
parenting, particularly homeschooling, leaning more towards the unschooling side, right? Just looking at allowing that natural system to evolve within our families. And then also underpinning kind of all of it is the inner work that we need to do to be able to hold space for all those parts, right? All those parts of
Yes.
our systems. So, yeah.
Yeah, definitely. That was a great intro and really cool about the social permaculture. I like that idea, and I kind of want to look into that a bit more. Um, Today we were saying let's talk about finding balance, and I feel like we can go so many different ways with this conversation. But I was really drawn to one of the quotes that you had shared with me, maybe not a quote, but more of a thought that you had about how homeschooling has a great overlap with like just good parenting. And it's a really interesting idea, and my immediate thought to that is to say like no, and I want to say no and figure out why that's not true, but I also want to say yes and figure out why that is true. um, do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I'm really excited to hear your no side too, right? And to kind of dig into that. Um, what I think about homeschooling and parenting is that, again, they're like what I said in the intro, is that they're really tied with that underpinning of the inner work and our
Mhm.
mindset. And
Yeah.
so the more that I think about homeschooling and allow myself to unschool myself, the more I see just how much of it is based on our mindset and what we think we should do, and all of the wonderful messages that we've received in our own growing up about what education should look like, what it means to be proficient, what it means to have mastery, and all these kind of unravelings of mindset that really were given to us. And so to me, I see a really lovely parallel as well with my parenting, right? Because we're given all the ways that our parents parented us and the ways that they were parented. And so we have to do a lot of digging into that and say, oh, is this actually how I want to show up? Is this what I want to bring to my parenting journey? So similarly to the educational journey, is like questioning that piece of like, is this what I actually want my child to think learning looks like? Based on my experience of education and their desires and the things that they bring into the world just innately, like as their own human selves, right? We all
Yeah.
have different passions and things that pull us in various directions. So I think what I was sharing there was really the root question for me is always the same. It's like, do I judging that the pieces that we've been given against what it is that we actually want going forward and what our children want going forward, right? And I think that's also too an underpinning
Mhm.
of how it ties with good parenting. It's like, oh, right, the child should be part of this equation, not just like us as adults imparting like, oh, this is what we think you should be doing, or this
Yeah.
is what successful looks like.
Yeah. Okay, totally. I I let me start with the no, because I feel like the no for me is like almost a side note, and then the yes, that's my I'm giving it away. That's my answer. I feel like yes is my answer. But I want to talk about the no a little bit. And the no for me is okay, when you enter homeschooling, it's like this paradigm shift, right? And that's a big shift because you have the hegemony, and that's school. And you're saying no to that. I thought about that. I don't want that for my family, and I'm doing something different. And it takes like assertiveness, confidence to do that. And you're starting to rethink. And when you start to rethink, I think like, for example, homeschooling is kind of like a gateway decision that you're going to start thinking more. However, I have experienced people that like, for example, making that jump into homeschooling, it's kind of like this liminal phase, like in between two worlds, where it's obviously uncomfortable. And then you kind of want to stop struggling and get back to like a comfortable area. And sometimes that comfortable area also means that you're not really growing anymore. So sometimes when you jump into homeschooling, I see adults that get stuck in, they're like, oh, well, here's my clique. And that clique winds up being like, I don't know, it winds up being like, almost like the world that they were in before, but kind of recreated now in homeschooling. And it's like a little bit of an echo chamber, if that makes sense. And in that way, again, this is not like most homeschoolers. It's just I've experienced this before, and it seems like there isn't growth happening at that point. And when that happens, I guess where I want to start is that good parenting usually means like constant thinking, right? Constant reflection, constant growth. Because you never like make it. You're never like, yay, I'm a good parent now. It's like, oh, I messed up here, and oh, where can I apologize here? And I thought this was working for us, but it's not. And which way can we like pivot to make this work for our family? But once you're into that, like we've made it kind of mindset, or I just want to get to the end destination, then you're not good parenting anymore, right? If we could say like this is good parenting and put a label on it, I feel like that's not it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it totally does. And I think that actually speaks volumes to just how much we allow our versions of education to influence the way that we show up in the world, right? That whole idea of good and bad, right? Like this is what good parenting looks like, this is what bad parenting looks like. And so we're going to create a dichotomy there, and we're going to fit in one of the two boxes. So
Yeah.
what you're talking about is just that mindset shift of actually there's no boxes at all. We're all just struggling along trying to figure this out one growth decision at a time. And so to me, it's that trajectory that kind of pulls those threads together between good parenting and being a good homeschooling adult or guide, I don't know, however you want to describe it, is allowing that journey to unfold and allowing that growth to happen in ways that we can't predict.
Yeah.
And I think that to me is where the beauty lies, right? If you just pull it back and look at natural systems for a minute, it's like, what does beauty look like to you? Firstly, if you have in your mind that it looks like a mowed lawn with curated gardens, then if you go into the woods, it might be more difficult for you to appreciate what's there and the diversity and all like the wildness, right? If you change your mindset to appreciate the wildness, you'll actually find far more abundance, far more variety and diversity of plants, animals, habitats in that wilded or rewilded environment. So again, it goes back to that mindset of like just breaking down the idea that we have this divide, right? Good and bad, right and wrong. And what I find interesting about that actually, Dan, is that, in schools, they're really trying hard now to teach kids growth mindset, right? Which is the underpinnings of what you're talking about. It's like, oh, well, we're making this decision and either it's going to lead us somewhere good or it's not quite what we wanted. And then we recalibrate and carry on. So they're trying to teach this in schools to kids. And I found it really difficult because I taught in the schools for 16 years. And I was one of those people like, I'm going to change it from the inside, right? This is how you do it. This is activism. And short of killing myself in an effort to do so, I tried really hard to bring these growth mindset pieces to that environment and allow kids to kind of set their own agendas and their own projects. But what I found is that inherently in the system, you've got a curriculum, you've got that eye on the outcome. Always, 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 because it's the report card needs to be written, the parent teacher interview, the child, should be progressing or reaching certain milestones. So inherently in the system, you've already got an outcomes-based system, and then you're trying to impose or superimpose something that actually goes counterintuitive to that, right? Like it's absolutely opposite.
Yeah.
And so that's actually why we chose to homeschool our own kids. I just couldn't reconcile, like, how can we have an outcomes-based system and then within that system be trying to encourage this growth mindset or this, evolution. And sometimes in permaculture, it's called emergence, right? Just allowing things to emerge and then follow forward. Yeah.
That's a good word. Yeah, I see this a lot in schools, and I'm not here to just like bash schools, but I see schools have this, they are a system and they have this rigid structure. And then, when we're looking at school reform, often what happens is whatever science tells us is helpful for children, it gets watered down, sanitized, and then like prepackaged and then like delivered to school. So like, things like kids' mental health or awareness or anything like that, it winds up being in the school structure. So then it's like, oh, okay, well, you have an hour of this, an hour of this, an hour of this, and now we're going to meditate for 15 minutes. That means that you'll have good mental health. And sure, maybe that is helpful, but in the long run, like the whole system itself is like kind of anti-mental health. Yeah, it's a really interesting thing. And another good word that I heard you say was outcomes. When we're focused on outcomes, it winds up being really negative. And I don't think, like, sure, there are positive outcomes that we can focus on. And like I said, like mental health. If you're like, okay, I don't choose school because the outcomes of school are, there's some negative things that I don't agree with, right? That's awesome. You're making that choice. And so at home, you're deciding to like work on things like connection, and making sure everybody is heard, things like that, and creativity and whatnot. But if we're talking about outcomes in terms of like, your father was a neuroscientist, so we want you to at least be in the medical field, and that would serve us well, and it would make your dad proud. Those kind of outcomes and that whole kind of intensive parenting mindset is, I want to put that into like the bad parenting category, and I think, again, it's not that you're doing things wrong or you've chosen to be a bad parent, obviously. It's that's just kind of normal in society. And so when we switch over to talk about like what is good parenting, it's like being conscious of what's going on, taking time, being curious, being aware, and thinking things through. And recently I shared on Instagram this really good quote by Alfie Kohn. And it was basically that in our life, we deal with a lot of professionals, whether they be, medical professionals or teachers. And those teachers never question our choices for parenting, the traditional parenting that's so popular today. And if they did question them, then we would be able to start thinking through. He said something like, we would be able to think twice about what our choices were. But as it stands, we don't even think once. So again, I feel like just most people are kind of just drifting along, dealing with things, and that includes intensive parenting, being reactive, and kind of following generational cycles. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that you're absolutely right in terms of bringing some mindfulness to that. and just noticing, like, how often do we stop and question things, right? And I think actually what you're pointing to there is just such a similarity between traditional parenting and actually what's happening in the schools, because those two things align very well in terms of like a power over system where you have the person in charge or the expert. And this happens in medical fields too, right? You go to the doctor and they're the expert and they tell you what's wrong with your body, and then you do these things and then you fix it. In the school, it's like, oh, the teacher's the expert. They have the knowledge. They pass it down to you. And so I'm not saying like inherently that can't be possible, but when that's the only way in which we impart information, then that's problematic, you know, because emergence happens when we're all allowed to speak and we're all allowed to be heard, and the underdogs, right, or in this case the kids, right, kids who are being treated as, you know, not as important in the system. Meanwhile, they have things that they come with, and they have knowledge and they have expertise, and maybe things that they're coming with from their own family that just can't be heard in the classroom setting. And it just can't, because I spent many years trying to make it work. I really did. And when you've got 25, 30 kids in front of you, it's just not possible to kind of merge all that information. And so systemically, there's this problem where we have this expert and the non-expert, right? Which is why we have this outcomes based, because you're trying to close the gap between those two things, right? So the outcome is get to where the expert is, or at least as close as you can get, right? Are you going to get an A or a B or a C, and making that jump? And what it ends up looking like in practice is just like a whole lot of jumping through other people's hoops all the time.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's really hard. And then in the process, you know, kids lose a sense of who they are or what they love. And coming out of school, a lot of kids now don't know what they want to do. There's almost like too many options on the table. Like maybe they don't have somebody in their family who's been a doctor before them, and then they have that thing that they're going towards. But maybe they're just lost in the sea of shoulds because they've been jumping through everybody else's hoops the whole time. They don't really know what their own are anymore. You know, they get to the end of it and they're like, well, what do I want to do with my life?
Yeah.
You know,
I feel like I raise my hand and be like, yeah, that was me. I jumped through all the hoops, and then I came out of college. Even going into college, I'm like, I don't know what I should pick for a major. And now looking back, I'm like, why did I go to college at that point, not even knowing what I was spending, like what I was getting all these student loans for. Yeah, definitely. So being aware. So I think if we switch over from like, you know, why I agree with, you know, this idea that there is a big overlap between homeschooling and good parenting. And I think it is because of that, like that paradigm shift. And like I said before, like it's almost like a gateway choice. You know, once you start homeschooling, then you're like, well, I said no to this other stuff and I put my foot down. What else isn't working for me? You know what I mean? And it's kind of like a nice little cycle that works with this constant questioning. And I think with homeschooling, and this is not always true, but I think homeschooling also helps because you have more time. And I don't necessarily mean you're like, oh, I have all this extra time. What I mean is you have more time to focus on family, right? And when you're focusing on family, or you're with your family for longer periods instead of like, you know, outsourcing their education to public school, you're making conscious decisions. And, you know, some days it might be grueling work, and you sit at the end of those days and figure out like what was wrong. Why were, you know, my daughter and I, you know, banging our heads against the wall? Why was there so much friction, and what wasn't working? Which again, I'm not, you know, obviously I didn't do any studies on this, but I often find that when I'm working with parents, I find that they start that first year when they're homeschooling is like so rigid. It's so strict, and it's so like, okay, we decided to homeschool, but let me make sure I'm doing everything and being legal, you know, and let me make sure I'm not screwing up my kids, and I don't want to be a horrible mom. You know, there are dads out there too that are doing this. But and then that first year is oftentimes so stressful for parents that even for some of them, they're like, this is not sustainable. Let's go back to the school system. But the parents that do hold on or are able to adapt and be flexible, that move along the path, the second year that they're homeschooling, they're already like, all right, we're going to back off on this curriculum a bit. And then oftentimes you'll see families work along and then usually stop or get cozy at some point along almost like the unschooling spectrum, if that makes sense. And so it almost, again, the fact that I've seen this happening so much makes me think that homeschooling, when you start homeschooling, you're starting to think more openly. And this is not necessarily causal, because maybe it's like most people that decide to homeschool were already kind of open-minded at that point. But I feel like once you make that decision, then there's more of a chance that you will be making other decisions like, hey, when am I holding on to too much control here? Like adult control. Or why am I telling my child that he can't be barefoot outside? You know, and then you come up with a lot of these why nots. And that winds up being like your guiding light of what is possible. Like, you know, why are we wasting so much time thinking about this or only being okay with this when there's all like this beautiful variety, like you're talking about in the woods. We have all this beautiful variety that's available. Why are we not tapping into this? It's just because we were conditioned to think that only one way worked up to this point, right?
Yep. And I love that you said what you said about unschooling as a continuum, because I think that is actually in real life how it is, right? A lot of people in the unschooling world like to treat it like that, like there's two, either you're an unschooler or you're not an unschooler. And I actually think it is a continuum, just like so many of these ideologies that we're engaging with. Because the more we can unravel our mindset about that and the fact that we have a one or the other, the more we allow ourselves to ask those questions, the more we actually lean into asking even more questions and unraveling some of those belief systems that we have that are no longer serving us, right? Like, why can't we wear bare feet? It's actually really good for you. There's a lot of benefits to earthing and grounding yourself. But I think, honestly, Dan, it has to do with deep listening and allowing ourselves the vulnerability of what that means to listen so deeply, because we all want so badly for our child to succeed. And like you were explaining about those first year homeschoolers, like I was one of them, you know, my kid way back when they would have been starting grade 1, like, this is learning time. That's what I knew. That's what we know. So we start from what we know, and then we allow the unraveling to happen. Mm-hmm. And I think for me, that's really an important piece of it, is like, we don't have to make the jump from here to there. We have to allow that process to happen, because it is a process, and it's a process really of deep listening to ourselves and what feels like it's in alignment, listening to our child, right? If they're resisting the work that you're giving them, there's a reason why. And if we don't listen to their resistance, if we just kind of like bulldoze our way through there, then that's not serving anybody at the end of the day, right? Because you're not actually going to create a situation where the child is going to be able to show up and learn whatever you're serving up. And what's different in that home setting than the school is, in the school setting, kids aren't able to be as vulnerable, right? There's the expert, the teacher standing over them. They have authority over them. So kids suck it up all the time, right? Like, oh, I don't really want to do this, but I'm going to do it because I don't want to miss recess. I don't want a homework, and I don't want to get an F on my report card. I don't want mom to get mad when I get home. So they override those deep listening pieces over and over, right? And that's, I think, how we get to the end of schooling, and kids don't really know what they want anymore because they're so used to override mode.
Yeah.
And the deep listening can be then applied to all these different systems that we have operating in our life, right? So yes, homeschooling is a gateway to beginning to question and beginning to listen deeply, because when, you know, if people are open to it, because some people, like you said, after a year, there's like, I can't do this, because they can't open to a different vision of how it could look. They just have that mindset of this is what school should look like. Because there's that weird overlap of like teacher being expert. So they're trying to step into that role and be the expert, but they're also the parent and they're trying to hold space for their child and that loving relationship. And so that mix doesn't go together very well, right? Because the kid expects you to show up in a certain way and you expect to show up in a certain way as the teacher. And then you have this bind, right? And so the idea behind the deep listening is how do you find that balance point where you're feeling good about what you're bringing to the table as a mentor, like as their homeschooling mentor, and your child feels listened and heard, excuse me, so that you find that place where you're meeting their learning edge, right? You're pulling them forward in various different ways, but they aren't necessarily what you envision, and they aren't necessarily what your child envisioned either, right? Like that crossover, that emergence of, oh, wait, here's something that neither one of us would have imagined. And then here we are together, listening to each other and trying to create like actually something that's more relational, right? More so than here's the outcome, meet the outcome. It's more an opportunity for learning and growing together and like a symbiosis, right? Like where you're working together. I think that, you know, if you can tip over into that point and just kind of put down some of the shoulds, then all of a sudden you just come out with like, oh, wow, this is better than I ever could have expected. You know, sometimes we hold on too tight and then we end up losing what actually the point is.
I love that. There's so many good words in what you were just saying. The idea of how school kind of overrides children, and that's so true. And what you just said with the symbiosis and growing together, learning together, because I find that when my son and I are most, you know, when I feel like we are most in harmony, it's when I'm kind of trying to see my child's perspective, looking through his eyes, and in that time we are usually like open, curious, playful, and like trying to learn together. And totally, yeah. But that balance isn't easy, right? And that's one thing that I want to talk about. And again, it's never like I found the balance and I got it. Right? It's
Never,
always
never, never, never.
never. And I have anxiety, so my anxiety will come into play too, where I'm like, I got this. And then, you know, a week from now, I'm like, I don't even know what I'm doing with my life today. Right. But yeah, it's like you have to pick through all of that. And maybe that's not even just like an anxiety thing. Maybe that's like your thoughts, right? Figuring out what thoughts are popping up and which ones you actually want to own and which ones aren't true about what's going on in your life, in your connection with your children. Yeah, but the balance. And you know what? One thing that I really like about you, Julie, is the amount of reflection that I see that goes into some of the content that you put up. Because I really like, and I didn't even realize that this is what you were doing with your stories, is that you group them by like a certain theme, right? And then you respond to them, to some of them. And then even in the stories where you're talking about like what's going on in your family, which you posted a while ago, are the amount of reflection that happens is really deep and really cool. And I'm seeing like a lot of metacognition, like thinking out loud, apologies to children, open communication, working together. But I don't think that is something like, I think there are families that are struggling with a lot of those pieces. And I think what you were saying was the key is kind of like really deep thinking. I'm paraphrasing. It's definitely not the words that you were saying, but like really finding out deeply what is going on and what you're thinking and what your values are, that inner work. What's your advice? What would be your advice to like get better at that? Or you know, is there a specific behavior that you do that helps you think about your life? Or you know, it's funny because I'm wondering if you are like a good person to ask this, because I see you as being someone who is so deeply reflective, or is it because you are
Sometimes
so
that means
reflective?
sometimes that means you don't know that you're doing it, right? Like,
Right, right.
yeah, sorry to cut you off. Was there more you want to say there?
No, no, no. That yeah, I just I want to hear what your thoughts are, and if you think that there's a way to like help others get into that mindset or those behaviors to be more reflective.
Yeah, I think listening to what you were saying before about symbiosis and how you and Kai can kind of like get into that together when you allow yourself to drop your, I'll call it your shield, right? Like when you allow yourself playfulness and adventure and just trying to get into his world. I think for me, it's a really similar process as far as being able to witness what I'm doing with objectivity. So, I coach clients as well, and this is something that I work a lot with people, is just like it's okay to allow ourselves to drop into places knowing that we're going to come back out of them, right? And I think that building that self-trust is really, really important. I actually was having a conversation with my daughter about this just the other day, and I was trying to like give her like an analogy so that she could understand what I was talking about. Because she gets angry sometimes and she doesn't want to talk about it. And I'm like, yeah, it's good. You got to kind of let your emotions flow through you. And so she's taking swimming lessons right now. And so I said, it's kind of like in the pool, like when you jump into the deep end, you don't know how to swim yet, but you're wearing your life preserver. So you're going to go underwater. Your head's going to go under. It's going to be uncomfortable for a second, but you know you're going to come back up again, right? And you're going to be able to see and you're going to be able to make choices. So for me, it's really about trying to get clear on our family values. And then when things come up that I'm like, I don't even know. Well, firstly, you have to ask the question, right? It's like you were saying about the Alfie Kohn quote. We have to be willing to ask the question once, if not 2, 3, 4, 27 million times, right? And just be able to say like, oh, is this actually working? So we got to ask the questions. And then we have to be okay with whatever comes. Like that's the part that's really hard, to be that observer and be like, oh, you know, it's okay to be angry with your life. It's okay to be angry with your kid. It's okay to not love how things are going. But until we take that look as the observer and be like, ooh, right? Like I'm actually owning this for what it is and all the emotions that come with it, not being like allowing ourselves to go under the water, right? Like in the pool, knowing you're going to come back up and knowing that you have agency and choice going forward, and that, you know, not all problems need to be solved immediately. But if we don't identify the problems and we don't look at our systems and how they are or are not serving us, then we can never have agency for change because we're just walking around with the blinders on, right? You have to be willing to kind of be vulnerable and be risky with your emotional self. So a lot of that comes with building self-trust and just allowing yourselves like little steps forward, you know? So for me, actually a lot of it started in teachers college, ironically, because they used to make us do these reflections all the time. And so we'd have to reflect on our teaching practice and like, how did you do in this lesson? And so I started that as a practice because I knew I had to write these stupid things like every single time I was in the classroom. So I just started reflecting like, oh, how'd that go? And I took it all personally. Right? Oh, I messed that up. I used to come home and I would have to debrief with my husband. Like I did this wrong and I did that wrong. Again, it's not about right or wrong. It's about the journey and being able to be like, oh yeah, that did suck. And I wish I didn't do that. Next time I would do da, 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 right? So allowing ourselves the vulnerability of like showing up in that yuckiness, like, oh yeah, that's not cool. Don't like that did not fit my values. That's not who I want to be. And this is how I would show up next time, right? So I work a lot with that idea of yes and, right? Like, yes, this happened and it sucked. And we still have the opportunity to move forward, you know? So building that trust and also like a good, nice, thick layer of self-compassion to go with that, right? It's like, not that it justifies, like our self-compassion doesn't justify our poor behavior. It allows us to see our humanity and be like, oh, actually, right? Like this is, you know, this is a human thing to not be able to show up perfectly every time, to not be able to nail it, to not be, you know, happy and go lucky all the time and, you know, having a great time with our kids, because that's not real. Like that's not human.
Yeah.
The human experience is like a whole range of emotions and a whole, you know, back to that unschooling sliding scale. It's like, okay, well, where do I fall on that sliding scale of emotions, and which pieces of that can I have agency in? Where are some small changes I could make that might have a big impact, or that I could at least try? Like, you know, I kind of treat my life like a science experiment where it's like, yeah, I don't really like this. I don't like that this is going on. I don't like how this feels. Let me try this. No better, or maybe it's worse. Now I'm going to try this, right? And just getting feedback. That's a really important thing in permaculture as well. It's like accepting the feedback that you're getting from the world, and sometimes it's not nice feedback, right? Like if your kid's yelling at you or they're putting up a stink about whatever you're asking them to do in their homeschooling work, it's like that's feedback for you. What it means is totally up to the family system and kind of all the dynamics and the unpacking that needs to happen there. But if we're willing to accept that feedback, then we can do something about it or with it.
Mm. Wow, again, like so much in what you said. And it's interesting. I feel like I'm like learning listening to you, because these are ideas that I've grappled with in my head. But then sometimes some of the things that you're saying, I'm like, oh, that's how like just the way that you're putting some things, like are connecting, making little connections in my head. It's kind of nice. I, I like, so I also went through, I got my teaching certification. I never actually became like a public school teacher, but going through that certification was a hard process for me. The learning part of it was awesome. All the studies that I learned, but being in the classroom for me was really hard because I met with a lot of cognitive dissonance. And I wasn't super aware of it at the time, but I just knew something was off. And I'm like, I can't do this. I can't do this. And it's hard to say I can't do this, especially when you've put like, you know, your career on the line to figure things out like that, right?
Well, Dan, I say good for you, because it took me 16 years to get to that same place. So like
Yeah,
you're ahead of the game. Like
maybe.
I was just overriding, right? So
Gotcha. All right. Yeah. All right. That makes me feel a little bit better then. Okay. Um, but yeah, there was like that cognitive dissonance just kept coming up again and again. And I'm like, all right, I learned everything about this is what works, and it needs to be individualized for children, and we need to connect with them. And then in the classroom, it was like, oh, you're not controlling them enough. And I'm like, oh my God, this is horrible. And I can't do this every day of my life. But what's interesting, what you mentioned about like those kind of grueling self-reflection journals, they weren't fun because they were extra work, right? You know, that you had to do. And I'm not even sure if my teacher read through them or my professor read through them at all, you know? But that was one of the jumping off points for me to be like, okay, it's good to be reflective, and let's spread this to other parts. And then I started reflecting on why that wasn't working. And it was never like I was doing something wrong, although that's what I've heard. That's what I've heard. I was taught that if your kids are misbehaving in class, it's always something that you're doing wrong. And don't get me wrong, I think that there is a shred of truth in that, because I think it's easy for teachers to be like, well, something's wrong, you know, or it's this other thing. And sometimes, you know, often there is something that you can change just a little bit about yourself. However, the system itself is like against us, and everybody's working towards generally that main goal. And as much as there are those like, you know, diamond teachers that are like diamond in the rough teachers that are, you know, sticking up for children or connecting with children or trying to change the system, it seems like it's always going to be the same system. But those reflection journals where I was looking through, that's where I started figuring out that like school is not what I wanted for myself. And then seeing my son get to that age of school, I was like, it's not what I want for him either. And then it brought up all of that, well, these are actually some of the wounds that I still have from when I went to school. Even though I was a great student, why am I acting in this certain way? And it's just, I don't know, it's just kind of ironic that you mentioned that, because it makes me think of how much that was like the turning point for me figuring out, whether I knew it or not at the point, for me to figure out that I was not all about school. Um, yeah, I don't know. Maybe I was just rambling there, but it was a really interesting connection to make. Um, and what you talked about, like yes, and self-compassion, self-trust, those are all huge things. And I think going back to, like, as a teacher, writing those reflection journals to now where I started journaling again, that I think those are the pieces where I'm like, oh, this is what doesn't feel good about what's going on in my family life right now. Or I want this to be happening and it's not. So let me just talk about that with myself. And you know what? Let me let me sign these journals with, hey Dan, I love you, you're doing great, and let me be okay with messing up, and let me apologize to myself. And if I'm apologizing to myself, let me apologize to my child and my wife, for when I yelled, for when I was rushing them when we didn't need to be rushing, for not thinking things through. And I think for me, just writing things down, and I might be biased because I'm a bit more of a writer, writing things down has like opened the door to be able to think things through. And if I didn't do that, then I would be still very reactive, still caught up in generational cycles. Not to say that I've made it, I'm at my destination, but to continually do that has definitely helped me, in my run. Are you still journaling at this point?
I journal when it gets to the point where I need to. So,
Good.
as a practice, it's something that I don't make enough space for in my life, because I do notice that it helps me. And so I do make space for it when I need it, right? Like when you're in, those crunch points where you just, like, maybe you've been in a bad mood for 2 or 3 days and you can't quite pick it apart. Like, you need to create a little bit of space for yourself. My practice now has become more internalized, because I've done it for a long time. That I watch myself, right? Like I kind of observe myself doing these things. And I always like to say, like, when you see yourself in the moment, right? Because often after something happens, like after I've yelled at my child, then I'm like, oh, I didn't like that. Then what happens as you observe it is it starts to back up, and then you can watch yourself doing it in the moment. Like, I am yelling. I am watching myself yell. I realize this is not how I want to be showing up. This is the best I can do right now. And that really hurts. That is like the hardest place to be, is like watching yourself doing it. But I always remind myself that when I'm at that place, that I'm so close to not even going there, right? Because the next step before that is, I see that I'm angry, I'm triggered, I don't want to show up in this way, and then I'm going to choose differently going forward. So it's, again, right, it's the same thing where it's a process. And if we expect ourselves to never yell, that's not realistic, right? Given, most of our childhoods and most of what we received from our parenting, it's not a viable option to think that we're never going to yell, right? That's just not, I think, evolutionarily where we are in our parenting journey. What's happening culturally right now is we're trying to break away from these power over dynamics in our households. And so we have to go through this really uncomfortable process of being between, like, generational parenting that didn't serve, and seeing something else that we're like, oh, I really wish we could do that, but then failing all the time, right? Because we're the bridge between it. And so the more we can kind of be the observer self in, like, our failings, like, oh, I'm jumping, but I'm missing. Oh, I'm jumping and miss again. And allowing ourselves that compassion to be like, yeah, we're going to screw it up. We're going to screw it up a lot, right? And it's also okay, because we see the other side and we're not giving up. We're just going to keep jumping, right? And one of those times, sometimes you make it over. Sometimes you make the jump and, celebrate it. Like, yes, look at that. We actually made it. And a lot of times we have to bring along that self-compassion and that underlying radical trust in ourselves to be like, actually, we see there's a better way, and we're rejecting something, but we haven't quite got the skills to make it over. And that's something that I think about a lot in my self-compassion practice, is like, okay, I don't have the skills to show up in anger without yelling yet, 100% of the time. Sometimes I do if I have good reserves. You know, I've been taking care of myself. I've had time to myself and like whole list of self-care things, which are not that easy to achieve sometimes as a parent, right? And so trusting ourselves to fail and do it again, right? Under we go in the pool with our life jacket on, up we come again, right? And we're going to try again, and we're going to jump off the side of the pool again and again and again until I can do it without my life jacket, until I can just jump in and swim, right? So yeah.
I'm thinking about one thing that I got out of what you were saying is that small steps are important. You have to take that first jump. It can definitely be a small step. And sometimes it's a misstep, right? And then you try and try again. And it's not easy, again, because we are breaking cycles. And it reminds me of, so I think about like, I get one of my pain points is when I feel that I'm doing something wrong, right? And it doesn't, like you're saying, it doesn't feel good to feel wrong or to feel angry, right? But you have to be okay with that. You have to let that be an emotion, and you have to experience that. It's what you do with that, you know, whether you let that take over your whole body or where, you know, you've worked to a point where you're like, this is my trigger and I have to do this to stop right now. Because I don't want it to turn into something I don't want, and that I've seen before. But I like that. For one thing, for me, the more and more that I've done this, is that I see that point, right, where I'm like, this is wrong, or now I'm in a wrong area that I don't want to be in, and I've talked with myself about this. But it's okay to be in that kind of gray area, even if you're like in the I haven't solved this yet, because we don't have all the answers, and it's right. And so it's like it's a guessing game in terms, sometimes a guessing game in terms of like what works. And this is not just for ourselves. This is like what works for our family. And one thing that we do is we'll have family meetings. We should probably have more than we have, but I feel like, along with what you're saying, we have family meetings when we need them. And so we will talk about, all right, these are the events that are coming up. This is something interesting that happened today, or, you know, throughout the week. We need the car on these days, or something like that. But also, this is one of the issues that has come up. And we let everybody talk. Everybody in the family gets to talk about, you know, how that is for them without judgment. They get to say their piece, right? And if we get to the end of the family meeting and we can't come to a conclusion or something to change, it sits there, right? And it sits there till the next week or our next family meeting. And that's okay. And it's really cool to see that, just being like, well, there's a problem and it's still there and we didn't fix it, but we didn't forget about that. And the fact that we talked about it in the family meeting, and the fact that we know we have another family meeting coming up, like it's on all of our minds. And just that, like allowing that to marinate, I think is really beautiful, because I do, before it, in my past life, I got caught up a lot in like the right or wrong, right? Or I'm a good parent, I'm a bad parent. You know what I mean? I did this bad, so now I'm a bad parent. But having an issue, talking it over, letting everybody talk about it, and just feeling it out. And if we can't all decide on something together, just moving to the, you know, letting time take over, and then let's address it again. Did anybody come up with any other ideas? Oh, here's another aspect. This complicates it, but that brings up another idea, you know, and let's try this, or let's make a family agreement for this next week, and kind of reconvene and see if that worked or not. So I think that's helpful.
Yeah, I think it's helpful for multiple reasons. It's helpful because you're leaning into that radical trust, right? That we're not going to put this down. As a family, this is something that's important to us, and we're not putting it down. We're going to trust that we're going to figure it out. And the other piece of that is it allows that emergence to happen, instead of having like, oh, it's on the agenda, we have to have this outcome, we have to figure this out right now, and we're going to push the issue. into maybe a solution that's not helping or not serving everybody in the system. Instead, it's like, oh, let's slow it down and allow something to emerge, allow us to kind of ruminate on this, give it some space and time, and have patience with the process. And it's not gone, but there's intention there, right? Towards moving toward a solution that actually is a restorative solution instead of a solution that's just like, oh, well, I've had enough of this problem. This is what we need to do. Just do it and be done with it, right? I feel that sometimes, right? As the parents, like, oh, I just want this over. I just want it done. I'm just going to tell the kids what to do, and then on we go. And so the more we can kind of resist that and allow ourselves to ruminate in that process, the more that we're going to allow ourselves to build that trust, right? Ironically, because it's cyclical. So the more we allow ourselves to come through these solution finding situations and come up with something that actually works, and sit through the discomfort of not knowing what that solution is, right? That's actually how we build that resilience and we build that trust so that we can move forward. And I like too that idea of like just kind of poking in on it every once in a while, because that's another foundation in permaculture is slow and small solutions. So we're always looking for like what tiny little things can we make changes on that's going to lead to great change in the long run, right? Allowing ourselves that time and that space and that time of observation, right? That feedback coming back like, oh, we're going to tweak this little thing and then watch how that changes or doesn't change things. Sometimes like what we think is going to work doesn't. I mean, gosh, don't even get me started on invasive species, but right, just like making those connections between like human ideas of what we think is going to work, how this is going to work in the natural world, or in this case, like our family system world. Sometimes we have an idea and we try it and it just blows up, it backfires. That's also feedback, right? And allowing that to become part of our journey forward. There's another thing in permaculture. We always say the problem is the solution, right? So within the problem, inherently the solution is embedded in there somewhere. So the more space we can give it and the more we can tease it apart, the more we have the ability to see or find that solution that's already available to us.
That's nice. That's nice. One thing that you said that it makes me think, how when we were children, we were overridden, right? And then we kind of ingrain that in ourselves. And then as adults, we override children, naturally. Like that's our default, right? And then the more that we can overcome that, right? The more that we can quiet that overriding nature. I don't want to say nature because it's not a natural thing at all. It's like definitely. The more that we can overcome that, the better it is to think about, I don't need to have the power in this family and I don't need to just be done with it. I need to take the time to share this, and whether it's a solution or, reward or what have you, letting other people in on. And I think that's another thing is that as children, we were often taught to do things by ourselves. Just get it done by yourself. And then that shows up with us as adults and as parents that we want to just be the problem solver, right? Without anybody's help. And that shows up in other ways too, how when we're struggling, we don't ask for help, right? Because that's what we've learned to do. To be quiet, because that was uncomfortable for adults around us as children, that we were struggling with anything, right? I'll give you something to whine about, or, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, just so many things that we have to break apart in adulthood. But we're coming up on about an hour now. I feel like this might be a good stopping point. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, no, that's good. This has been a really wonderful conversation. I knew it would be because I follow your content and I love the things that you come to the table with and share. I just know that we're on the same wavelength in terms of like just wanting to really break down some of these things we take for granted as part of our culture and say, hey, actually, is that the way we want to be showing up? Right? Is that actually how we want power distributed? Is that actually how we want to be creating our family systems and our life systems? And just one more point that I wanted to add to that is I think that the basis of all this, right, is rooted in this capitalist ideal. Like that whole, like when I was hearing you tell me back that, like, this is a bad one to drop right at the end, but like that, like, got to get it done right away, right?
Mm.
Just get it done, be done. Like that mechanistic ideology of like outcomes, right? That's really, all this is in that container culturally, right? Of like, oh, we just want the outcome. We just want to get it done. We want people to produce things. And the more we can kind of break that down and look at process rather than what we produce at the end, I think the more that we're going to be able to allow ourselves to break these things down and like expand into, I think, what humanity can actually be, right? We don't have to fit ourselves in these boxes.
That was a heavy one to drop at the end. You were right.
Sorry, I couldn't help myself. It was coming out for me. I'm like, oh, should I say it? Should I not say it? I should have just said goodbye. But
Yeah, no, I totally agree with everything there. And oftentimes, yeah, our problems come down to the system that we're in, or systems that we're in, should I say. And it's hard to be like a level-headed parent when you're struggling with things like capitalism, racism, global warming, politics, you know, et cetera, et cetera. It can be so hard to find the space for yourself, and then on top of that, the space for your children. So anyway, I think you're doing awesome, and I'm gonna keep following your content, especially your stories. Hopefully, I can remember to like find them every time. But yes, this has been an awesome conversation, and I will post it later, so keep an eye out. But again, thank you so much, Julie. This was awesome.
Thank you, Daniel. I had a lot of fun. Oh man, I could talk about this stuff all day. Thanks for cutting me off at an hour.
All right, take it easy.
Okay, bye-bye.